It was just after 11 p.m. on a muggy summer night in Alabama when the alarm bells cut through the prison's thick, suffocating silence. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, bouncing down the long corridors lined with steel doors and tiny windows where inmates pressed their faces, curious and wide-eyed. Something was wrong in the south wing, the part of the prison usually reserved for storage and maintenance supplies, a place where inmates weren't supposed to be unsupervised. Guards rushed toward the scene, boots pounding against the floor, radios crackling with urgent calls. By the time they pushed through the heavy metal door of the supply room, the smell hit them first. Sweat, rubber, something faintly metallic. And then they saw her. On the ground, sprawled out between shelves stacked with cleaning chemicals and crates of handcuffs, lay a 400-pound female inmate. Her massive body looked almost unnatural in the cramped space, her limbs bent awkwardly, her neck pulled back at a sickening angle. A restraint strap, one of the very tools used to control prisoners, was cinched tight around her throat. Her eyes were glassy, fixed in a lifeless stare at the buzzing fluorescent light above. The scene had all the markings of a violent prison brawl. A shelf was tipped over, supplies scattered across the floor, as if two inmates had gone at it in a burst of rage that ended in tragedy. To the untrained eye, it could have been dismissed as yet another casualty of prison life, another headline about inmate-on-inmate violence. But something about the details fell off. The first responding officers stood in stunned silence. One of them muttered, "Damn, this looks bad," as he carefully stepped around the body. The strap around her neck was a tool that was usually locked away. How had she gotten it? And why had no other inmates been reported in the area? Cameras monitored nearly every corner of this prison, but for some reason, the storage room had a reputation for blind spots, places where shadows could swallow a person whole, even under the watchful eye of surveillance. As the paramedics arrived and confirmed what was already obvious, that the inmate was gone, the whispers among staff started almost immediately. She wasn't just any inmate. She was one of the loudest, most demanding women inside those walls, known for throwing her weight around both figuratively and literally. Even officers had been overheard complaining that she always seemed to get more than she should. Extra food trays, cigarettes, even whispers about things no inmate should ever have. Now here she was, dead in the most suspicious of circumstances, and the question was on everyone's mind. Who had crossed her? The investigation began the same night. Detectives snapped photos, marked the floor with yellow evidence markers, and collected the strap as the most obvious piece of evidence. Still, the prison's internal gossip spread faster than any official report. Some guards muttered about a fight gone too far. Others said she had been blackmailing people on the inside. A few lowered their voices to almost a whisper, suggesting something far more explosive, that one of their own had been involved. The scandal would soon be splashed across every major newspaper and nightly news program under a name that would stick: the prison love murder. Reporters would describe it as a case straight out of a crime drama, an illicit affair between a corrections officer and an inmate that spiraled into obsession, blackmail, and ultimately bloodshed. But on that first night, inside the prison walls, all anyone knew for certain was this: a guard who had been seen as dependable, a man with nearly 15 years of service under his belt, was suddenly avoiding eye contact, his hands shaking, his story not quite lining up. The prison chaplain later recalled that he had never seen a group of officers so tense, so quick to cover for one another, yet so clearly hiding something they couldn't put into words. There was a shadow in that place, he said, like everybody knew a secret, and nobody wanted to be the first to speak it. As dawn broke over the razor wire fences, the media vans began to line up outside. By then, the inmate's body had been carried out under a black sheet, But the scandal she left behind was only beginning. Soon, investigators would pull surveillance footage, uncover text messages that should never have existed, and find fingerprints that would shatter the cover story. The truth, ugly, humiliating, and deadly, was waiting to come out. And when it did, it wouldn't just expose a murder. It would expose a forbidden affair that had turned the balance of power inside this prison upside down, leaving one woman dead and one man's life in ruins. That night's discovery was only the first step into a story of desire, betrayal, and a desperate attempt to keep secrets hidden behind bars. What no one could have imagined was just how far one man would go when the walls started closing in. Before the scandal, before the whispers of betrayal and the headlines that would follow him forever, the man at the center of the storm looked like an ordinary correctional officer. 38 years old, broad-shouldered but soft around the middle. He was the kind of guy you'd pass at the grocery store and not give a second glance. He had worked at the Alabama prison for almost 15 years, punching in for night shifts, filling out incident reports, doing the kind of thankless labor most people couldn't imagine. His name wasn't known outside the small town where he lived, and for a long time, that was exactly how he liked it. At home, he had a wife who had been with him since their high school days and 2 children who still thought of him as a provider, if not exactly a hero. They lived in a modest brick house on the edge of town, with a yard that needed mowing more often than he had the energy for. Bills piled up just like they did for any working family. His wife worked part-time at a dentist's office, juggling schedules to keep the family afloat. On paper, it was the picture of stability, but under the surface there were cracks. He felt those cracks every night when he left home and drove down the Tulane road that led to the prison gates. Prison work has a way of wearing a person down. Day after day, surrounded by men and women who had nothing to lose, a guard has to be both a cop and a counselor, a disciplinarian and a babysitter. Over time, he started to feel invisible, unappreciated, and trapped in a cycle that felt impossible to break. Promotions never came his way. Younger officers with less experience were already climbing the ladder. He wasn't the loudest or the most ambitious. He was steady until he wasn't. Friends described him as a guy who kept to himself, not a talker, not someone who went out of his way to socialize. But they also remembered a restlessness in him, a low-grade bitterness he carried. At family gatherings, he sometimes drank a little too much and complained about his job, muttering that nobody respected what he did, not the inmates, not the administration, not even his own wife. Behind closed doors, the marriage had cooled into a quiet routine. The intimacy that once bound them together had faded, replaced by late-night arguments about money, about his long shifts, about the way he seemed to come home exhausted and detached. Inside the prison, though, it was different. There, he wore a uniform that gave him authority. In a place where everyone else was stripped of freedom, he was the one with the keys. For a man who felt overlooked everywhere else in his life, that sense of power mattered. And that was the danger. The same walls that made him feel important also made him vulnerable. It's no secret that some inmates know how to exploit weakness, how to spot loneliness, how to sense when a guard is hungry for something more than his paycheck. Coworkers would later recall small changes in him. He started showing up early for shifts, lingering in certain areas longer than necessary. He seemed distracted, quicker to snap at colleagues, but also strangely lighter at times, as if he was carrying a secret that both thrilled and terrified him. One fellow guard said, "Looking back, you could tell something was going on." He wasn't the same guy anymore. What nobody saw clearly then was the quiet storm brewing inside him. He was torn between the man he thought he was supposed to be, a husband, a father, a provider, and a man he was becoming inside those prison walls. The longer he worked there, the more those lines blurred. He knew the rules better than anyone. No personal contact with inmates, No favors, no crossing boundaries. But knowing the rules and resisting temptation are two different things. Late at night, when he drove home along empty roads, the weight of his double life pressed down on him. The silence in the car was deafening. He wondered if his wife noticed how distant he had become, if his kids sensed something changing. But he also told himself that nobody could understand. He was tired of being invisible, tired of feeling like life had passed him by. This is where the seed of disaster took root. Not in the storage room where a body would later be found, but in the quiet, grinding dissatisfaction of a man who felt cornered by routine and invisible in his own home. All it would take was one inmate who knew how to read that weakness, one conversation that crossed the line, one small favor that seemed harmless at first. From there, the fall was inevitable. And while the world would one day label him a killer, in this moment, before the affair began, before everything unraveled, he was just another correctional officer trying to survive the monotony, desperate for something that made him feel alive again. He had no idea how deadly that hunger would become. Her name carried weight inside those prison walls long before investigators would see it splashed across national headlines. At 36, the 400-pound inmate was impossible to ignore, not just because of her size, but because of the force of her personality. She had been locked up for nearly a decade, serving time on a cocktail of charges: drug trafficking, assault, and a string of fraud cases that showed she wasn't just reckless, she was cunning. She wasn't the type to fade into the background. She demanded attention, and more often than not, she got it. The other women in the unit whispered about her, as if she were both a threat and a protector. If you were on her good side, you might get a cut of her extra food tray or the protection of her booming voice when trouble stirred. If you crossed her, you'd quickly learn that her size and reputation made her someone you didn't want as an enemy. Prison is a place where survival is often about leverage, and she had plenty of it. Over the years, she'd cultivated a reputation for manipulating officers as easily as she manipulated fellow inmates. She was sharp, observant, and willing to use whatever she had, her words, her body, or her intimidation, to secure favors. To the guards, she was a headache, always asking for more, always testing the boundaries. But she also knew when to turn on the charm. She had a way of smiling just enough, of lowering her voice to sound almost vulnerable, of making even the most hardened officers feel like they were the only one she trusted. That duality, intimidating one minute, disarmingly friendly the next, was her weapon. She played the long game, studying routines, learning personalities, waiting for the right weakness to reveal itself. That's how she noticed him. The 38-year-old officer who seemed tired, distracted, and weighed down by something he never spoke about. While other guards barked orders with authority, he sometimes lingered at her cell door a beat too long, or answered her small talk when he should have kept walking. She spotted the crack in his armor immediately. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't immune. The first steps were subtle. She'd ask for an extra carton of milk in the chow hall, flashing a smile as if it were a harmless request. He gave it to her. Then it was an extra tray. Then cigarettes. Contraband that could buy loyalty and protection from other inmates. Each time he gave in, she tucked the memory away, building a mental file she could use later. What he saw as small kindnesses, she saw as leverage. But it wasn't just about manipulation. There was something more twisted in the dynamic that grew between them. She was used to being confined, controlled, told what to do. But with him, she flipped the script. Behind closed doors, she held the power. She made him feel chosen, special, in a place where he otherwise felt invisible. She teased him, flirted when no one was watching, and slowly pulled him deeper into her orbit. For a man starved of attention, her interest was intoxicating. Other inmates began to notice. Whispers spread through the cell blocks. Why did she always seem to get more than her share? Why did this particular guard hover around her more often than others? Some suspected a fling, others thought she had dirt on him. In prison, rumors are currency, and these rumors spread like wildfire. Still, nobody dared confront her directly. Her size, her voice, and her reputation made sure of that. She played her cards carefully, alternating between gratitude and threats. "You're the only one who looks out for me," she'd tell him in a low voice. Other times, she'd let her words drip with menace. "Imagine if your wife found out how much time you spend down here." By then, she had already secured his phone number through a smuggled contraband cell. Late at night, she'd send him messages that mixed seduction with intimidation, a dangerous cocktail that kept him hooked and terrified at the same time. Prison records later revealed that she had tried similar tactics with other guards in the past, but none had gone as far as he did. He wasn't the strongest, but he was the most desperate. That made him her perfect target. The imbalance of power, the secrecy, the high stakes, it was all fuel for her game. And she thrived on the game. To the outside world, she was just another inmate serving time in Alabama. But inside those walls, she was larger than life, both literally and figuratively. She didn't just exist in prison. She ruled her corner of it. And when she found a one guard weak enough to bend, she made sure to pull until he broke. This was the woman whose life would end in a storage room, a strap around her neck. But long before her final breath, she had already set in motion a deadly chain of events, driven by desire, leverage, and a ruthless understanding of human weakness. In many ways, the murder that shocked the prison system wasn't just about one man's crime of passion. It was the inevitable result of a woman who knew how to exploit power from the inside out. It started the way so many forbidden things do, small, almost innocent gestures that didn't seem like much at first. An extra tray of food passed quietly across the counter. A cigarette slipped into her palm during a late-night round. A few extra minutes by her cell when he should have moved on. To outsiders, these might have looked like harmless rule-bending, the kind of thing some officers did just to keep the peace. But between the guard and the inmate, each favor was a brick in the foundation of something darker, something they both knew could never see the light of day. The first real shift came one night when he lingered too long in the storage corridor. She had been assigned to mop, and he should have walked away after checking her work. Instead, they started talking about the heat in the prison, about food from the outside world, about anything that had nothing to do with cell counts or lockdowns. When her laugh echoed off the walls, low and husky, he felt a spark he hadn't felt in years. In that sterile, suffocating environment, her attention felt intoxicating. For a man whose marriage had cooled into silence, who spent his nights driving home on empty roads with nothing but static on the radio, it was like a shot of adrenaline straight to the heart. From there, the encounters escalated. He found excuses to pass by her work detail more often. She found reasons to catch his eye, leaning closer when she spoke, lowering her voice so he had to step nearer to hear. Soon, their conversations were laced with suggestion, with words that carried weight far beyond small talk. In the prison's labyrinth of rules and surveillance, every glance, every brush of the hand carried danger, and that danger made it all the more thrilling. It wasn't long before she pushed the boundaries further. One night, when most of the unit was locked down and the cameras in the hallway were angled just right, she slipped into the storage room and waited. He followed minutes later, his heart pounding in his chest, the keys on his belt jingling softly with each step. When he opened the door and found her there, the decision had already been made. The line had been crossed. What happened in that dimly lit room was messy, rushed, and reckless, but it bound them together in a way neither could undo. Afterward, he tried to convince himself It was a one-time mistake. He told himself he would never do it again, that he could put it behind him and go back to being the steady officer everyone expected. But prison is built on routine, and routine meant seeing her again the very next day. The smirk she gave him across the chow hall told him it was far from over. Their encounters became more frequent, more brazen. She demanded late-night visits, and he obliged. She wanted contraband, snacks, a cheap phone, small luxuries that could shift the balance of power inside those walls, and he smuggled them in piece by piece. Each demand came wrapped in a promise. Another night together, another whispered secret. But behind that promise was always the unspoken threat. She had the power to ruin him with a single word, and he knew it. What he felt wasn't just lust. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. For the first time in years, he felt seen. In a prison uniform, among the endless faces of inmates and officers who barely acknowledged him, she looked at him like he mattered. She played to his hunger for validation, for control, for intimacy he hadn't known in so long. He didn't see manipulation. He saw connection. But it was a connection forged in lies and shadows, doomed from the very beginning. Other inmates whispered, but whispers don't make it past the gates. Other officers noticed his distracted gaze, his sudden bursts of defensiveness when her name came up, but they chalked it up to stress. On the surface, life went on, but beneath it, he was sinking. Every night, he gave in to her. He tightened the noose around his own neck. She, on the other hand, thrived on the secret. She bragged in coded ways to the women in her block, letting them guess but never confirm. She relished the power of having a guard at her mercy. In her world, where freedom had been stripped away, this affair gave her leverage. It gave her something no prison walls could take: control. By the time he realized he was in too deep, it was already too late. The affair wasn't just physical anymore. It had become an addiction. He craved her attention, even when it came wrapped in threats. He risked everything, his badge, his marriage, his future, just to keep her satisfied. The thrill of secrecy had become chains around his wrists, dragging him deeper into a trap he couldn't escape. What began as a stolen moment in a storage room had grown into a full-blown relationship built on contraband, lies, and late-night encounters no one was supposed to know about. And like so many forbidden desires, it carried the seeds of destruction. For him, it was a lifeline he thought he couldn't live without. For her, it was leverage she intended to use until it broke him completely. The affair that no one was supposed to see had now crossed into something dangerous, something unsustainable. And in the unforgiving world of prison, secrets don't stay hidden forever. At first, he told himself he was in control. He had the keys, the uniform, the authority. She was the one locked up, dependent on him for every extra privilege. But in prison, power is rarely as simple as it looks. By the time he realized who truly held the upper hand, it was already too late. The turning point came one night when she slid a contraband phone across the floor toward him, the glow of the screen lighting her face. "Keep this safe from me," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. But when he glanced down, he didn't just see a phone. He saw messages, photos, proof. Proof that their affair wasn't just a rumor. It was documented. She had made sure of it. From then on, the tone shifted. What had once felt thrilling and dangerous in a way that excited him now took on a darker edge. Her requests became demands. She wanted more food, more cigarettes, more time. She wanted makeup, clothes, even drugs smuggled in from the outside. Every time he hesitated, she would remind him with a sly smile. "Imagine what your wife would think if she saw these." Or worse, imagine what the warden would do. The weight of her threats pressed down on him like the prison walls themselves. He began to see her not as a secret lover, but as a captor. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was the guard, and she was the inmate, yet he was the one trapped. At home, the pressure showed. His wife noticed his absences, the long nights where he claimed he was covering shifts, the way his phone never left his side. The kids tiptoed around him, sensing the storm brewing beneath the surface. He drank more, slept less. Every glance at his phone screen reminded him of the texts she sent at all hours, some filled with promises of what she'd do the next time he visited, others sharp with threats that cut to his core. Inside the prison, whispers grew louder. Other inmates began to suspect she had something on him. Some even taunted him when he walked past, making crude jokes that he couldn't afford to acknowledge. Fellow guards noticed his temper, flaring more often, the way he seemed constantly distracted, as if he were carrying a secret too heavy to share. He snapped at colleagues, avoided eye contact, and withdrew further into himself. She, on the other hand, reveled in the control. The other women in her block saw her with fresh respect. She always seemed to get what she wanted. Cigarettes appeared. Extra food trays stacked up. She walked with the swagger of someone untouchable. The rumors that she had a guard wrapped around her finger only made her more dangerous. And she loved it. In the storage room where their affair had begun, their late-night meetings became battlegrounds. He would beg her to ease up, to stop demanding so much. She would laugh, reminding him that she held the evidence that could end his life as he knew it. "You think you're scared now?" she taunted once. "Wait until the warden reads our messages. Wait until your wife sees." Each demand chipped away at what little sense of stability he had left. He pawned valuables to afford the contraband she wanted. He lied to his wife, to his co-workers, even to himself. He convinced himself he was buying time, that somehow he would find a way out. But deep down, he knew there was no way to undo what he had done. She had him cornered. The power dynamic flipped so completely that he could barely recognize the man he had been just months earlier. He no longer walked the tiers with authority. He slunk through them, eyes darting, hoping no one noticed the weight he carried. He was living a double life where the walls of his marriage and the walls of the prison both felt like cages, closing in tighter every day. And yet, despite the fear, he couldn't cut her off. Part of him still craved the way she made him feel when she turned soft, when she reminded him of the intimacy he no longer had at home. It was a twisted dance of desire and fear, one that left him caught in the middle of a storm he couldn't escape. By the time investigators would later piece together the timeline, they would see clearly what he could not. This wasn't an affair anymore. It was blackmail. It was coercion. It was a relationship built not on passion, but on control. She had all the leverage, and she wielded it without mercy. And with every passing day, the strain pulled him closer to the breaking point. He was a man caught between two lives, terrified of exposure, desperate to keep his family intact, but too deep in the prison shadows to ever come back into the light. It was only a matter of time before something snapped. The night it happened didn't look any different from the dozens of others that had come before. The prison hummed with its usual late shift noises, doors clanging shut, distant voices echoing down concrete corridors, the low buzz of fluorescent lights that never seemed to go out. But for him, the guard who had been unraveling for months under the weight of secrets, this night felt heavier. His chest was tight, his stomach sour. He knew she was waiting for him in the storage room. The same room where everything had started, the same room where it was all spiraling out of control. She had insisted on it. Her texts all day had been relentless, bouncing between threats and demands. "Bring me what I asked for, or I swear I'll let them all see." Then another, "You don't want your wife to get a call from me, do you?" Each message made his pulse spike. He had ignored her once, weeks earlier, and she had punished him by hinting to other inmates that she had a secret about him. That scare alone was enough to keep him hooked. But now she was pushing harder than ever, cornering him with no way out. When he opened the door to the storage room, she was already there. Her massive frame leaned against a shelf stacked with cleaning supplies, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of someone who knew she had the upper hand. "You're late," she said flatly, her voice carrying more authority than his uniform ever did. He mumbled something about patrols, but she cut him off, shoving a contraband phone toward his chest. "Do better. I need more. And this time, you're going to bring me something real." He tried to reason with her, his voice trembling as he explained that he couldn't keep stealing, couldn't keep covering for her. But she only laughed, a deep, mocking sound that echoed in the narrow room. "Oh, you're done?" "No, baby. You're not done until I say you're done." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "You want me to tell your kids what Daddy's been up to? You want your wife to see these pictures? You think the warden won't believe me?" Something inside him snapped then, like a thin wire pulled too tight for too long. Months of fear, humiliation, and self-loathing boiled over. His hands shook as his breath came in short, ragged bursts. He begged her to stop, begged her to understand, but her smirk only widened. She shoved him in the chest, her voice rising. "You're mine? Do you hear me? Mine." What happened next played out in a blur. His eyes landed on the restraint strap hanging from a hook on the wall, a strap meant to subdue violent inmates. His hands moved before his mind caught up. He grabbed it, his chest heaving, and in one swift motion, he looped it around her thick neck. At first, she thought it was another show of his desperation, another plea for control. But when he pulled tight and the strap bit into her skin, panic lit her eyes. The struggle was brutal, the confined space amplifying every sound. She clawed at his arms, gasping, her weight crashing against the metal shelves. Supplies toppled, bottles spilled across the floor. He gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body straining as he held the strap tighter, tighter, until her gasps turned to gurgles and then to silence. When her body finally went limp, the only sound left was his own ragged breathing and the buzz of the overhead light. He stood frozen, staring at her lifeless face, his hands still gripping the strap. The enormity of what he had done hit him in a wave so powerful it nearly dropped him to his knees. This wasn't just about an affair anymore, or about secrets and blackmail. This was murder. And in the cold, merciless world of prison, there was no coming back from that. Panic took over. He scrambled to rearrange the room, shoving supplies, tipping shelves, trying to stage the scene as if two inmates had fought violently. He loosened the strap just enough to make it look like a weapon grabbed in desperation, not a calculated choice. His hands left sweaty fingerprints on every surface, but he wasn't thinking clearly enough to notice. He only thought about survival, about covering the mess he had created. When he finally stepped out of the storage room, his face was pale, his uniform damp with sweat. He told himself he could still make it work, that the prison was chaotic enough for a cover story to hold. But deep down, a voice gnawed at him, reminding him that cameras never sleep, that secrets always find their way into the light. In that moment, as the prison around him carried on in its grim routine, he became something he had sworn he'd never be. He wasn't just a guard anymore. He was a killer. And though he didn't know it yet, the walls that had closed in on him for months had finally sealed shut, leaving him trapped with the truth of what he had done. The official story at first seemed straightforward. A violent inmate fight, tragic but not unusual in a maximum security Alabama prison. When officers responded to the storage room, they found a scene that fit the narrative. Overturned shelves, scattered supplies, a heavy-set inmate strangled with a restraint strap. On paper, it looked like just another case of prison violence. But from the very beginning, certain details didn't sit right. The warden ordered an immediate lockdown and called in outside investigators. Standard protocol. Detectives from the county sheriff's office walked into the storage room within hours, cameras flashing as they documented every inch. One of them noticed how odd it was that the strap used as the murder weapon had no signs of fraying, no indication it had been in a chaotic tug-of-war. Instead, it was clean, taut, almost deliberately placed. Then there were the cameras. While the prison system didn't cover every inch of the storage corridor, it covered enough. Review of the surveillance footage showed the victim entering the hallway minutes before her death. But what raised eyebrows was the figure who followed her in, a uniformed guard, the very man now pacing nervously as detectives questioned staff. The camera didn't catch the actual struggle. The angle cut off inside the room, but it caught him walking out alone, his face pale, his hands shaking. Other evidence piled up quickly. Forensics dusted the strap and found his fingerprints, clear and undeniable. He tried to explain it away, insisting he had used it earlier that day to restrain another inmate. But records didn't back that up. His fellow officers couldn't recall any such incident. The strap, investigators concluded, had been taken from storage shortly before the murder. Then came the cell phone. During a search of the victim's belongings, investigators recovered a smuggled device tucked under her mattress. At first, it was assumed to be just another contraband phone, one of dozens circulating inside the prison. But when detectives powered it on, the truth came spilling out in a flood of explicit text messages, late-night calls, and compromising photos that left no doubt about the nature of the relationship between guard and inmate. He wasn't just a suspect in her death. He was her lover, her provider, her secret. The text painted a damning picture. Weeks of demands from her, punctuated by panicked replies from him. Promises to bring her what she wanted. Pleas for her not to expose him. And then, the day of her death, a chilling exchange where she threatened to tell his wife if he didn't deliver. Investigators now had motive, opportunity, and physical evidence all pointing in the same direction. When detectives confronted him, his story cracked almost immediately. At first, he denied everything, claiming he had stumbled upon the body after an inmate fight. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The video showed him entering. The fingerprints placed him at the scene. The texts revealed his affair. And then came the testimony from other inmates who had noticed the special treatment she received, extra food, cigarettes, favors no one else got. Some even claimed they had seen him slip into her cell after hours. Rumor became corroboration. The arrest came swift and public. One moment he was sitting in the break room, sipping burnt coffee from a styrofoam cup. The next, detectives were leading him out in handcuffs as his fellow officers stared in stunned silence. The sight of a corrections officer, once sworn to uphold order, being perp-walked through the same gates he had guarded was almost surreal. News traveled fast. By the following morning, local stations were leading with the story. Prison guard arrested in inmate murder. Within days, national outlets picked it up, dubbing it the prison love murder. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Microphones thrust into the faces of anyone willing to talk. How could a man entrusted with authority fall so far? How could a secret affair inside a prison end in such brutality? The scandal cut deep. His wife filed for divorce almost immediately, blindsided by the double life he had been living. Fellow guards faced scrutiny for not reporting suspicions earlier. The warden publicly condemned the betrayal, calling it a stain on the integrity of this institution. For investigators, the case was airtight. The murder weapon, the fingerprints, the surveillance footage, the damning digital trail of texts and photos. Layer upon layer, the cover-up unraveled until only the ugly truth remained. A guard had crossed the line, fallen under the sway of an inmate, and when the secret threatened to destroy him, he chose murder over exposure. As the pre-trial hearings began, the prosecution's narrative was clear This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a calculated act by a man desperate to silence the woman who held his career, his marriage, and his freedom in her hands. And while the defense would scramble to argue otherwise, the weight of the evidence left little room for doubt. What had begun as whispers in the prison hallways had exploded into a national scandal. The trial that followed was the kind of spectacle small-town Alabama courts rarely saw. Reporters packed the courthouse steps each morning, cameras flashing as deputies escorted the disgraced guard in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. Protesters gathered outside the gates, some demanding justice for the slain inmate, others shaking their heads at what they saw as a betrayal of the badge. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, every creak of the wooden benches drowned out by the whisper of pens scratching across reporters' notepads. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They presented the story in a neat, devastating arc. A married father of two, respected on the surface, who succumbed to forbidden desire. An inmate who manipulated him into smuggling contraband and giving her special treatment. And finally, the breaking point where he chose murder to silence her threats. They showed the jury surveillance footage of him entering the storage corridor just before the killing and then leaving alone. They displayed the restraint strap, his fingerprints circled in bright yellow on the forensic photographs. And then they unveiled the text messages, hundreds of them, flashing across the screen in the darkened courtroom. Explicit words, desperate pleas, naked photos. Each one chipped away at his defense, exposing the scandal in painful, humiliating detail. His defense attorney tried to spin another narrative. They argued that the inmate was violent, known for manipulating guards, and that she had attacked him in that storage room. The killing, they claimed, was self-defense, a moment of panic in a chaotic fight. But the evidence didn't support it. There were no defensive wounds on his body, no sign she had the upper hand. And the cover-up, the stage scene with the toppled shelves, only made him look guilty. The most devastating testimony came from fellow inmates. One by one, they described seeing her with privileges no one else had, extra food trays, cigarettes, even whispered conversations through the bars after lights out. Some admitted they had suspected for months that something inappropriate was going on. Their words confirmed what the jury already suspected, that this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, but a sustained, illicit relationship that turned toxic. When his wife took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. She spoke with a quiet fury, describing how she had stood by him for nearly 20 years, raising their children while he worked endless shifts. She recalled the night she learned of his arrest, how her children cried when they saw their father in handcuffs on the evening news. "He chose her over us," she said simply, her voice breaking. And when he couldn't hide it anymore, he chose murder. By the time closing arguments came, the outcome felt inevitable. The prosecutor's final words echoed through the silent courtroom. This defendant thought he could hide behind his badge, behind the prison walls. But no wall is thick enough to keep out the truth. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He would now spend the rest of his life behind the very bars he once patrolled. The media dubbed it the prison love murder, and for weeks, it dominated headlines. National talk shows dissected every angle. Commentators debated whether the inmate was a victim of her own manipulation or simply a woman caught in the crossfire of power and desire. True crime podcasts picked apart the text messages, the timeline, the psychology of a guard who had everything to lose and still chose the most destructive path. In Alabama, the scandal left scars. The Department of Corrections faced questions about how such a blatant affair could go unchecked for so long. Lawmakers demanded reforms, stricter oversight, more cameras in blind spots. For the other officers at the prison, the betrayal stung deeply. "He made us all look dirty," one guard told reporters, shaking his head. "We work our asses off every day, and now people think we're all like him." For his children, the fallout was unbearable. Classmates whispered. Teachers avoided eye contact. His wife moved them to another county, hoping to shield them from the glare of the scandal. But the internet never forgets, and the headlines followed them wherever they went. And what of the inmate, the woman whose death set this all in motion? For some, she was seen as a manipulator who played a dangerous game and lost. For others, she was a victim, exploited by a man in power who should have known better. At her funeral, a small group of family and fellow churchgoers gathered, remembering not the inmate she had become, but the girl she once was, funny, loud, and full of promise before life turned down a darker path. The story of the guard and the inmate became a cautionary tale whispered in training sessions for new corrections officers. Never cross the line. Never believe you're immune to manipulation. Never think you can keep secrets inside a place built on watching. It was more than just a scandal. It was a warning etched into the walls of Alabama's prison system. In the end, the case left behind no winners. A woman lost her life. A man lost his freedom and his family. 2 children grew up without their father. And a prison system already plagued with violence and distrust gained another stain on its record. Epilogue. What lingers from this story isn't just the salacious details of a forbidden affair, but the way human weakness can corrode even the strictest institutions. Behind those gray concrete walls, where order and authority are supposed to rule, desire found a crack, slipped through, and destroyed everything in its path. It is a reminder that power without boundaries becomes poison, and secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always claw their way into the light.